Welcome back, and here we go again. We're going to continue with our discussion of cells. And last time we did the quick introduction. We talked about the difference between the prokaryotic cells, the very simple cells, and the more complex eukaryotic cells. So now let's get right into it and look at some of the features that all cells have. And today we're just going to do a real short one on the kind of the outer coating, the cell membrane and cell wall that cells will have. And so if we look at the first slide here, we'll talk about the cell membrane. This really, it isolates the cell. It provides an inside and an outside. And the main thing that you've got to take away from this today is if we look at the lower left here with the picture, it's made up of two main parts. It's got a lipid bilayer. So we've seen the phospholipids when we talked about biomolecules, and it's got proteins embedded in that bilayer that allow for transport. So in terms of the structure, those are the two main things that we're looking at right here. We're looking at phospholipid bilayer and transport proteins. So what this will do is will control movement in and out of the cell. It makes it selectively permeable, which means that it's going to allow some things in and out, but it blocks other things. So not everything can get in and out. And it separates the cell from its environment and helps maintain homeostasis. So this idea that it's going to be stable and maintain a constant internal environment is going to be very important as we continue. And if we look at another diagram of that phospholipid bilayer, so again we see those phospholipids, we've got the transport protein here, so that will allow materials to move in and out. I want you to focus in on the phospholipids a little bit closely. Now look at the cartoon over here on the right, so phospholipids. And as we saw with the biomolecules, they've got two fatty acid tails and a phosphate heads. So now we're going to introduce two terms that are going to be very important when we talk about these membranes being selectively permeable. The first is hydrophilic. So hydro means water, philic means liking. So the phosphate head is hydrophilic. It means it's attracted to water. It gets along well with it. So if you notice the phospholipid bilayer, the phosphate heads are on the inside and the outside. Now these fatty acid tails coming off. Now you know how well water and oil interact. They don't. So these fatty acid tails are what we call hydrophobic. That means they're water-fearing. So they project into this middle region here where on the diagram it says the hydrophobic region. So when we think about the cell membrane and the phospholipid bilayer, we've got to think about how the outer and inner edges are hydrophilic. They will interact with water, but the middle part of it is hydrophobic and it doesn't like water. And that will become important when we talk about cell transport and movement in and out. So one final picture about the cell membrane, and this one's a little bit more detailed. It's got some of the other pictures in there, and if you look at it, there's one in particular that I'm going to focus on. I'm going to right here, the glycoproteins. So we can see the phospholipid bilayer. We can see the integral proteins and how they can make transport channels. But the glycoproteins are the third component that's very important because they regulate or they are involved in cell-to-cell interaction and recognition. So when two cells are in contact with one another, they'll almost talk to each other and they can recognize if the cell is supposed to be there or not, and will control a lot of movement in and out of the cell. So just to wrap up real quickly for the cell membrane, the three parts that you really have to remember are the phospholipid bilayer, the transport proteins, and the glycoproteins. One other thing that I'll point out to you right now is if you look, there's cholesterol in here. So cholesterol is important in cell membranes. It helps keep them fluid and moving as we do that. And the last thing that we'll look at today is going to be cell walls. Okay, so now only plants have cell walls, and it's another layer of kind of support and protection around the membrane. So if you look in the upper left, plant cells do have cell membranes, but they also have a cell wall between the individual cells, and it gives them some more support. And between or along the cell wall, there's these holes called plasmodesmata, and that's actual tubes, holes if you will, that allows movement of materials between cells in plants. And if you just look at this diagram real quick here, what we can see is that in the upper left, you've got your plasma membrane, the green and yellow down at the bottom, and then you've got all of these microfibrils, and here's your cell wall. And then on top of that is something called the middle lamella. And if we look over here on the red, the middle lamella, they described as kind of the glue between two cells. So if we have two plant cells next to each other, they've each got their own cell wall, but they're kind of stuck together with this middle lamella there. So that wraps up what we're going to look at, kind of the outer part of the cell. In animal cells, that would be just the cell membrane, but in plant cells, we've got a cell membrane and a cell wall that's there for protection and support. And we'll continue on our tour of the organelles and the cells next time we get together.